You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 24th of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The International Court of Justice seeks to rein Israel in. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's re-election campaign grows increasingly inexplicable. And will Paris's best-known fashion house find the Olympic flame a source of warmth? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers least keen to go out in this weather were Tom Webb, Alexis Self and Natalie Theodosi. They'll discuss the day's stuff, and we'll have live music from Sea Shanty's The Longest Johns. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we start with the International Court of Justice, which has formally ordered Israel to cease military operations in Rafah in the south of Gaza, at least up to a point. The ICJ has instructed that Israel must end operations which, quote, may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, which may turn out to be somewhat in the eye of the beholder. The ruling, the result of a case against Israel brought before the court by South Africa, has been predictably welcomed by Hamas and equally predictably condemned by Israel, even the country's opposition leader Yair Lapid calling it an abject moral failure. It is at any rate one thing for the ICJ to make a ruling and quite another to enforce it. Well, I'm joined by Rosa Friedman, Professor of Law, Conflict and Development at Reading University. Rosa, first of all, how actually open and shut is this? It's being widely reported as a blanket instruction that Israel must cease and desist, but it's not quite that straightforward, is it?
No, and in this era of TikTok and 1 minute news, people look for the headline of the court has ruled this or the court has ruled that. Well, in fact, the International Court of Justice has said, is very clear, that it can't order a ceasefire as a blanket ban in terms of Gaza because it's not inevitable that a genocide would occur through Israel's continued right to self-defense in Gaza. It's also said the same thing about Rafah. It said, look, this is a zone which Israel designated as a humanitarian zone. It issued evacuation orders very early on, asking Palestinians to move to Rafah in order to not be part of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in North Gaza and then in Central Gaza. The court has ruled very clearly that Israel must take all necessary steps to avoid any kind of military incursion in that region that might bring about in whole or in part the destruction of the Palestinian people. That is a very clear reference to the Genocide Convention, but it has not banned Israel from military incursions in Rafah. It's just reminded it or called for it to comply with international law when it is going into Rafah, seeking to destroy a terrorist organization and secure the release of its hostages.
To which Israel's inevitable rejoinder is going to be, that's what they've been doing all along. Now, whether or not that is the case, that has always been Israel's claim, that they are doing everything they possibly can to avoid civilian casualties. As long as Israel sticks to that line, will this ruling from the ICJ actually make much difference to anything?
Well, let's be clear that there is an absolute humanitarian catastrophe going on in Gaza. That humanitarian catastrophe is partly caused by the 7th of October and Hamas and what it did in Israel. It's partly caused by the closure of Rafah by Egypt, which has refused to allow civilians to come into Egypt while this rooting out of a terrorist organization happens. But it's also happened because of Israel and the way in which it has waged this war. People talk about humanitarian aid trucks being more now than they were before the war, but they forget that Gaza grew so much of its own food before the war, which clearly it hasn't been able to do since 7th of October. Every side can spin this in the way that they would like to spin it. What the International Court of Justice has been clear on is that Israel has a right of self-defense. It has the right to seek out the return of its hostages and to root out a terrorist organisation who, in its charter, has a genocidal intent, but also that the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Gazan civilians have a right to live. And life isn't just about living, it's also about having adequate access to water, to sanitation, to food, to healthcare facilities, and to be able to live the kind of life that you and I expect to live within a human rights framework. So this ruling does not condemn any one side. What it's seeking to do is to help all sides to remember that civilians need protection during times of war.
But does it have any potential legal ramifications if Israel ploughs on regardless? And it certainly seems that that is their intent. Benny Gantz, the former IDF chief of staff, now member of the War Cabinet, has said as much. There have been reports of strikes hitting the Shabura camp in Rafah shortly after the announcement by the ICJ. It's not clear if that was related, though. But if Israel does just carry on more or less as it has been, does this judgment establish any kind of legal marker that might be brought to bear upon Israel's leadership in the future?
But the difference between international courts and national courts is fairly clear when it comes to enforcement. You can't send the bailiffs round to a country. You can't put a country into prison. So enforcement, where it comes to the International Court of Justice, comes actually through other member states. Countries might say that they won't trade with a state that doesn't comply with the rulings. They might say that they won't have ambassadors or diplomatic relations. It comes through peer pressure. What's going on currently in Rafah may well be within international law. As I said, the court has not ruled that there can't be any military offensive in Rafah. It's just reminding Israel of its international law obligations towards civilians in that space. And it's very important to remember that if a terrorist organization is using a civilian space to launch rockets or any other kind of incursions against a country, that then makes it a legitimate military target. What the court didn't do today was make clear the parameters of what Israel can and cannot do in Rafah. And that in many ways is a shame. The court should have turned around and talked about both sides to this war and reminded both sides of their obligations. And the fact that they only focused on one side of this war was clear when Hamas turned around and praised the court for its ruling.
Just finally then, and speaking as somebody who deals with this stuff for a living, how frustrated are you by the way that this gets reported? You mentioned earlier the TikTokization of news, and I'm reading now from the BBC's homepage where the headline simply says, top UN court orders Israel to stop Rafah offensive.
I think the most incredibly frustrating thing for someone in my position, let alone people who are working on the ground, is that there are people suffering right now. There are people suffering because they have no access to food or to water and sanitation. The most vulnerable people will be the children, the women, people with disabilities, and the elderly. And there are similarly people suffering because they are internally displaced from the north of Israel and have not been able to go home since the 7th of October because of attacks from an Iran proxy in Lebanon called Hezbollah. The frustration for me is that the focus is always on the top level, on the states, on the terrorist organizations, on their leadership, and never on the individuals on the ground who most need the help and who most people around the world are looking at wanting to help.
Rosa Friedman, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Daily. This is the Monocle Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and it is day 2 of the UK's general election campaign, and there appears to be no greater danger to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak than his own comms team. Having taken him yesterday to a brewery, where the jokes rather wrote themselves, they have today whisked him to Belfast, specifically its recently regenerated district known as the Titanic Quarter, with consequences someone should probably have forecast.
Prime Minister, we are just yards away from where the Titanic was built and designed. Are you captaining a sinking ship going into this election?
So if you look at what's happened over the past few weeks alone, you can see that our plan is working. Inflation has returned to normal. Energy bills just today, we received welcome news, are falling. Wages have been rising faster than prices for 10 months. And at the beginning of this year, our economy grew faster than pretty much all our major competitors. So whilst I know, of course, there's still more work to do and people are only just...
I'm joined now with more on day 2 of the election campaign by Monocle's Deputy Head of Radio, Tom Webb, and Monocle's Foreign Editor, Lex Self. Lex, first of all the places one could spend day 2 of one's election campaign, you go to a place which built the world's best-known metaphor for disaster caused by the complacent hubris of the person in charge.
But it's perfect. It's perfect. How do you turn incompetence into something to be celebrated? Sunak's gone to the source.
It's astonishing, isn't it, Tom? It's almost like Sunak is embarked on some sort of Brewster's Millions style challenge. Like, how many votes can I lose in 6 weeks?
I think you're being cruel. I've been to the built-up area that is the Titanic exhibition and Dockland, and it's absolutely glorious. It is a celebration of how cities can reinvent themselves. Belfast used to be part of the 3 Bs, which was Bosnia and Beirut and Belfast, and it is now one of the most enjoyable cities to take a little trip to.
Nonetheless, I would keep well away from anything containing the word Titanic were I attempting to steer the ship of state, Lex, in any particular direction. And we should, I think, try to break this election down for our doubtless bewildered international listeners at this point. If we frame it in terms of the 2 people, when I say the 2 people likely to be the next Prime Minister, we all know there's one person likely to be the next Prime Minister, but the incumbent will give it a crack. How is Rishi Sunak trying to pitch himself, do you think?
Well, I think for the Tory party, I think especially for Sunak, it's rather hilariously perhaps he's banking on competence or at least experience as opposed to Starmer and the Labour Party. Obviously, some people might think that they haven't shown much competence in the past, 14 years, the Conservatives, but they have the experience of government, which, excepting a few Labour politicians who are old enough or who have been in politics long enough to have served under Gordon Brown or Tony Blair, it's quite a callow-looking opposition. Again, Labour might say that's something to be celebrated, but I think that's the thing. You know, I've been doing this now for a year and a half, and the country hasn't collapsed yet. Do you trust that?
I like the yet.
Yeah.
Give me time.
Well, exactly. I mean, you know, all political careers end in failure, they say. And Sunak perhaps hasn't failed just yet, although the speech outside Number 10 in which he announced the election might be considered inauspicious.
It might, especially if one was grasping for some kind of prize-winning understatement. Tom, what do you think Sir Keir Starmer's pitch over the next 6 weeks is going to be? Is he indeed even going to make a pitch? If I was him, I think I would be tending towards, actually, you know what? I'll be here if you need me.
Yeah, certainly. It's definitely make politics boring again. And he is not going to put himself out into any sort of risk areas. He's very pro-unionist, so his first day of campaigning was in Scotland, which was a very smart decision. Scotland feel very abandoned by the current government. Boris Johnson never rung them when he became Prime Minister. And the first thing Sir Keir does is goes out campaigning because he knows the Scottish National Party is in total disarray. Huge scandals. They're going to lose dozens of seats, maybe 30, and Labour are going up there to sweep them all up. So he's looking to reclaim not just the north of Great Britain, but the north of England as well. The Red Wall is what we call it. Like many countries around the world, there's a big north-south divide. And the north, typically struggling a little bit more than the South economically, was hoping that the Conservatives was going to lift them out with a levelling up policy, which never materialised. They voted Conservative for the first time to punish the delays over Brexit, in protest as well to Corbyn, and also because they like Boris Johnson. Those 3 things are gone, so Sir Keir is coming up to sweep it back up.
Obviously, the main dynamic of this election, Lex, is that the Tories have been in power a very long time, and as is often the case, certainly as the polls are suggesting, everybody's heartily sick of them. But beyond everybody being heartily sick of the Conservative Party, does it strike you that there actually are any issues being wrangled over in this campaign?
Well, I think the Conservatives will focus on immigration, as they tend to do, or as right-wing parties have tended to do around the Western world over the past 10, 15 years. Mm-hmm. The immigration policy of the Sunak government sort of swings between farce and tragedy, and frankly, Sunak's flagship...
Sometimes both, in fairness.
Well, exactly. Well, the Rwanda policy, which is Sunak's flagship policy, which is to deport migrants to Rwanda, has failed, and that wasn't. I mean, that was a policy that he inherited from Boris Johnson's government. I think, even though immigration will be a huge focus, and it will verge at times, I think, on an attempt to kind of whip up a certain type of xenophobic sentiment among the electorate. I think that immigration as an issue is actually only a priority for a very small number of British voters, and perhaps that sector, that slice of the electorate, have an oversized influence on the final result, being concentrated in certain constituencies, as I think Tom mentioned, in the Red Wall, perhaps the age of those people who are concerned by that. But I think most people care about their own personal finances. I think that's the biggest issue. And I think there's a feeling that over the past 14 years, these have gotten worse. And I think that the data bears that out. And I think that ultimately is why the Conservatives will likely lose the election.
Tom, I was struck by what one of our guests on the Daily said recently. This was Bill Hayton, whose wife is going to be a Labour candidate at this election, and he has been out in Chelmsford, I believe it is, knocking on doors on her behalf. And I asked him what kind of concerns are people raising on the doorstep, and he said it's either like hyper-local, like they're potholes and bin collections, or it's everything. And there is a general sense, I think, that has descended on this country in the last few years, for all that the British, if I may say so, traditionally do have something of the Eeyore about them. But there is just a sense that nothing actually works, that the trains don't go anywhere, that you can't see a doctor, and that all the stuff that's just basically supposed to function, and kind of seems like it does in most other European countries, here it just doesn't.
Well, I just got back from the Netherlands, and it felt like nothing had happened in 30 years, particularly in the fashion and the high streets. But no.
A big hello to our many Dutch listeners.
No, but I do agree the policies is quite fascinating. I've worked on a few election campaigns as a journalist, and the issues that people are passionate about. The economy was always last. No one cared about the economy, and the NHS was top.
So it's not the economy, stupid.
No, but it is now the economy, as Lex was just saying. People, because they've noticed that things have gotten very expensive, they've become very, very angry and upset. And even though, as voters, you might think the British public react and will just, vote Brexit, for example, but actually they can be won over if the policies are strong enough. They are listening. They are not caring just about potholes. So it is the economy, it is education, and the NHS has fallen to the bottom of the pile for now.
And I think on that economic stuff, I think Truss, Keir Starmer almost just needs to say Liz Truss every time he gets up to do a speech, and people's blood will begin to slowly simmer to a boil. But I think Truss's economic implosion, her mini budget, made people think about their mortgage. Obviously home ownership is almost the thing which defines the British economy, or rather, if there were to be a British dream or American dream equivalent, it would be to own your own home. And therefore, so many people in this country have mortgages, and when those go up, lots of people notice. I think the bigger thing, and if the Labour Party were being a bit more radical about this, they could, and they had better communicator as their leader, they might put forward a more radical alternative to what I think many people see as a kind of broken economic system. We're talking about people being worse off, but then the Sunday Times Rich List came out last weekend, which is this annual list put together by the Sunday Times newspaper of the richest people in the UK. And Rishi Sunak's in it with his wife, Akshata Murthy. They've actually gone up the rich list in the past year, gained an extra £122 million during the course of 2023-24, putting their combined wealth at £651 million, which is more than King Charles. Now, that in itself, is not a reason to, well, lots of people will say not a reason for Sunak not to win the election. But I think there is this sense that, while some people, a very small group of people, manage to game the system enough to make lots and lots more money, everyone else is just about getting by or actually is worse off.
Just finally, Tom, that sense that Sir Keir Starmer could possibly afford to be a bit more radical is a common frustration among people who have been long-term Labour voters, especially towards the left of the party. But if you are him and what you actually most want to do is win this election, is it not... Well, is he basically just assuming that all I have to do is go 6 weeks without being filmed biting the head off a bat and this is in the bag?
That is honestly, I think, all he has to do. And for purposes of balance, I have house sat on Sir Keir Starmer's street. He is rather salubrious. He's doing quite well. Very nice house. But Sir Keir, yes, Lex.
Well, no, I thought that's an interesting thing about both of the main candidates, is that actually if they talked a bit more about themselves and their own stories, both could, I think, legitimately say that they have they are examples of British meritocracy at its best. Keir Starmer was born into a working class family. His father's a toolmaker, his mother's a nurse. He became the director of public prosecutions, a knight of the realm, and as you say, quite a wealthy North Londoner. And Rishi Sunak's parents were immigrants, from East Africa, Hindu immigrants who had their own pharmacy. They sent their son to Winchester School, one of the best public schools in the land, and now he's the Prime Minister. I think, actually, on that front, they don't differ too much. But perhaps both of them could make more of an advantage of that, but it doesn't seem to be the way they're going.
Like Self and Tom Webb, thank you for joining us on the Monocle Daily. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and now to the latest issue of Monocle magazine. It is the June issue. It is out this week, and it is focused quite heavily on Paris ahead of the Summer Olympics. That includes the fashion pages, which include an in-depth profile and interview with Chanel's president of fashion, Bruno Pavlovsky. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, who wrote it. Natalie, welcome to The Daily.
Thank you for having me.
This is a big, in-depth story on Chanel and on Mr. Pavlovsky, but I wanted to ask first of all about what it's like to actually visit Chanel. How fancy is it?
It's very fancy, as you would imagine. And I was very lucky to have lots of different visits. And it started in Paris. I went to their couture show in January and then went to Mr. Pavlovsky's office, which is just behind Rue Cambon, which is the original flagship shop. And it's beautiful, huge building. Everything is black and white. Everyone is dressed in tweed and looks immaculate. So it was an amazing experience.
It sounds like somewhere I would fit right in.
Exactly.
How excited are they about Paris? Do they see this as a big opportunity for Chanel? I mean, it's not like Chanel needs the publicity necessarily.
So they actually think that this summer there will be a bit of a slowdown, given everything that's happening in Paris.
I.e. everybody leaving.
Exactly. Everyone is leaving, getting around is harder, but nevertheless, they are very excited about the momentum because Chanel and Paris are synonymous. And it's really been a year where the city has such a spotlight. So inevitably you're going to benefit one way or another.
I mean, other than trying to avoid the Olympics, what else are Chanel working on? What are they excited about at the moment?
I mean, what are they not working on? They've just announced their recent financial results. And unlike a lot of their other competitors, which are seeing dips in sales, they saw 20% increase, and their total global revenues are coming close to 20 billion euros, which only Louis Vuitton is the other house that has reached that scale. So they're doing extremely well. They continue to grow. And just a few weeks ago, they've done an amazing show in Marseille, in the south of France, for their Métiers d'Art collection. And I think now they're plotting new destinations, a new couture show in July, and I think they're not over-expanding their retail stores, but because the stores are so popular, if you go on Bond Street here in London, there's queues of people waiting to go and shop. They're thinking about how do they improve customer service, enlarge some of the boutiques to make sure that customers are always satisfied and able to go in and get what they want.
You mentioned the events, and as the piece explains, they have been doing some events in places which might not necessarily leap instantly to mind as the kind of places where you would expect Chanel to do an event. And this is no shade at all on either city, but Dakar, Manchester?
Exactly. I think that's actually one of the most interesting things that came up in my conversation with Bruno Pavlovsky. He said that after the pandemic, they felt kind of a desire to start exploring. And it started with Dakar, which has an incredible, like a very thriving creative scene. And they just saw an opportunity to go to connect with locals, to learn about what's going on and get inspiration from there. And Pavlovsky was really honest. Like you said, that they knew that they don't have connections in that city. They don't know much. So to do it respectfully, they just connected with a lot of local artists. They went, they met people there, they spent time in the city. And then they just thought that that's a great model and a way to keep inspired and to keep excited. So they came to Manchester and then they went to Marseille. And it's all cities where they don't have boutiques, they don't have big commercial interests, but it's a way for them to meet new people, enlarge their circle. And also when they go into these cities, they create a lot of opportunities for the locals. They bring in money. So it's a win-win, and it's a really interesting way, I think, to approach the destination show and to give it a little bit more meaning than just going to Saint-Tropez and hosting a regular show.
But this is what I was wondering, though, the extent to which they do see this as a two-way exchange. So he just to be clear, he's not saying it's just a way for us to attract attention to ourselves. If they go off what might be thought of as the beaten path for a company like Chanel, they might actually learn something. They might acquire some new ideas.
Absolutely. And that's kind of, they spend months meeting locals, searching the creative scene and finding these people who work with them. I mean, when I was in Marseille, everything down to the tablecloths where they were serving dinner were hand-dyed by a local artist. Mm-hmm. And that all... It's such a long process. There's so many creative conversations that happen to get to that final stage of the 2-day event that, of course, the creative director, Virginie Viard, is inspired by the people that she meets and she does these creative collaborations with. And like you said, it's an exchange. In Manchester, they worked with a lot of interesting musicians and writers, DJs. So they inspire her and her design process as much as they inspire the locals of the city that they visit. So
just finally then, how long before we are all dressing like Mancunians?
I think it's just a matter of time. the Manchester collection is dropping in stores soon, and I really want they have shirts and dresses with the teapots embroidered on them. So it's coming.
Natalie Theodosi, thank you as always for joining us. You're listening to The Daily. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and finally on today's show, live music. And perhaps, who knows, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak found himself humming a sea shanty as he plotted a terrible revenge upon whichever advisor booked him a visit to a district named for the world's foremost maritime metaphor for hubris-induced disaster. If so, he could have done worse than borrow from the songbook of our guests, the Longest Johns, now more than a decade into a noble quest to reinvigorate the sea shanty tradition. Hello, the Longest Johns.
I'm Robbie.
I'm JD. And my name is Andy.
First of all, how did all this start? Because you have been doing this a while.
It kind of started by accident, to be honest. So about 12 years ago, we were just a group of friends, pretty much, all working for a performing arts charity, and happened to all start listening to sea shanties at the same time, because it was around the time that Fisherman's Friends first started to make some really big headlines and everything. And we were at a party, and we're discussing music, and sea shanties came up, and we decided to give it a go. And that was the start of the band, really. So that evening, we went and sung at an open mic night for a bit of fun. We had a great time, and we just never stopped.
Where do you find the source material, though, now? Are you still discovering new sea shanties that you hadn't previously heard of? Have you become kind of a locus where people want to send you their favourite sea shanties in the hope that you'll do them?
We do get that, yeah. I mean, the inspiration beforehand was we spent years going around sea shanty festivals and folk festivals in Cornwall, mostly. And, we'd be listening to all these great bands that we admire, like just singing all these songs, and every now and then we'd hear one and go, "Ooh, I fancy that one." And then Andy would go like, "Oh, well, I fancy this one." And we'd just start singing them, figuring out harmonies, and it would grow from there.
The best organic way to do it, right? Pretty much how it was back in the day.
Certainly
Word of mouth.
Certainly was for us.
Yeah.
But as people who had been doing this for a good while, was it at all vexing to you when sea shanties became a bit of a thing during lockdown and lots of people with nothing better to do were all of a sudden joining enormous Zoom calls and harmonising at each other about life on the ocean wave?
I think it was fantastic. I mean, we were fairly responsible for it as well.
We can't complain. We certainly can't complain.
I was not vexed at all. Yeah, the whole kind of lead up to that was a very strange time for us because we'd just officially all gone full-time with the band at the start of 2020.
Oh, fantastic timing.
Yeah, perfect. We'd just recorded an album in February and we're planning to release in June. And everything just completely shut down. But we've been doing loads of live streaming and recording videos for YouTube and stuff at that time. And so when everything just shut down and we're all stuck at home, we just carried on streaming, but more, and making videos and everything. And we found there was a video that we made in the summer of 2019 using Wellerman, kept on every couple of months going viral on a different platform. And so for us, every couple of months or so, our listener base would suddenly double. We'd be like, wow, this is crazy. I can't believe this has happened. All the way up until January 21, where it suddenly did it again on TikTok. But then suddenly the phones started ringing from record labels and stuff saying, hey, what's going on with this thing?
Is it too much of a reach, do you think, to think that people kind of identified with the sea shanties when they were, as the seafarers of yore were, confined to quarters in often somewhat difficult and hazardous circumstances? Or am I trying a bit hard there?
No, I think at the time when somebody first mentioned that, and we were kind of, no, that's surely not. But I really can't find another reasonable explanation for it. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, there's definitely something very communal and inviting about the sound of it anyway. And especially when there are opportunities for people to sing together and experience something of connection again when you're stuck at home in that sort of way. It is something special about that, especially that's what everyone was lacking at that time.
Performing the songs the way you perform them, and you do perform them, as we will shortly hear, in due homage to their original rowdy, upbeat, defiant spirit, do you get any pushback at all from your more purse-lipped, chunky-jumpered folk purists who tend to regard songs of a certain vintage as these pristine museum pieces which must never be taken out of their glass cases?
I can't say we've not had a little bit, but generally people are quite nice, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of an identity thing for us in some ways. We played at a festival in my hometown quite a few years ago, and there was someone there that used a perfect example of what I like the Longest Johns to kind of be in like the sea shanty world. And it was like a gateway drug in some ways into like the wider world of folk music and sea shanties, in that what we do is a lot more accessible than necessarily those pristine museum pieces. But
it invites people in to experience those and find those and see those as well as being more accessible to more new people, which I love, because the more people we can get hearing it and singing for themselves as well, the better, really. That's the dream.
The thing we like to not forget as well is we're still reading from the same playbill as the Chunky Jumpers, as you say.
Yeah, we are.
We're all listening to these old songs and doing our own interpretations and doing our own versions of these songs. So I don't really have a problem with people like who want it one way. There's plenty of artists they can go and listen to. This is just how we do it.
Well, at the end of the day, we're just doing what we think is fun and not really worrying too much.
We will shortly hear an example of you singing a great sea shanty, but from performing all the ones you have learned, performed and written, have you come up with, I guess, hard and fast criteria about what makes a great sea shanty? What does it actually need?
Ooh, we have our suspicions as to how we do it.
Repetition.
Yes, lots of repetition. I think we were saying to you earlier about the way we sort of construct a lot of our songs. So we find like JD's obviously got a crazy nice heavy low end on a lot of the songs. Hello, you do your little advert for washing machines. So that sort of underlies it. It needs to have just a strong melody. It needs to usually have a decent pulse to it.
Mm-hmm. A good story and a good melody is always very important, though, because we do a lot of emotional, slow songs as well. Yeah, there's always something that like draws you into it, whether it be like the sound and the story and everything. But yeah, there's something always captivating, and like we were actually saying earlier as well, a lot of the songs from more traditional scenes and so on, the reason they still exist now is because there is something really special in them, and kind of finding out what that is and being able to emphasize that and make the most of that is kind of what makes our sound, I guess.
Well, just finally then, and on that thought, introduce, if you would, the song you're doing for us today.
This is a sea song called Shawneetown. It is a riverboat song from America.
So more a river shanty than a sea shanty.
Yeah. It was, I don't know what else to say about it, really. It's like a classic shanty. It's got kind of nonsensical verses. It's not really like a story per se, but they were used as work songs. So often the version we're singing has, 5 verses? Sometimes they'd have 10, 20. I've seen sea shanties online.
Depends how long the job was.
Yeah, totally. And they just make up verses all day. But yeah, it's a riverboat song from America, used for people who are working on the rivers.
Well, let's hear it. The Longest Johns, thank you.
Sun rose up, but we floats down, way down the Ohio to Shawneetown, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Whiskey's in the jug, boys, and wheat's in the sack. We'll trade 'em down to Shawneetown and we'll bring the rocks all back, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Oh, them good old boys, they talk so loud and long. They're white as a barrel and they're twice as strong, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. The water's mighty warm, boys, and the air is cold and dank, and the cursed fog, it gets so thick that you cannot see the bank, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Now the current's got her, and we'll take up the slack. We'll sail her down to Shawneetown and we'll bushwhack her back, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Sun rose up, but we floats down, way down the Ohio to Shawneetown, and it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. And it's hard on the beach or she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio.
And that was The Longest Johns. Their latest album is Voyage. They're playing tonight in Ottawa, tomorrow in Montreal, and more dates can be found at thelongestjohns.com. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Lex Self, Tom Webb and Natalie Theodosi. Thanks also to Rosa Friedman. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.